A fatal message reached Richard Berman from his ex-wife Jennifer on January 13, 2014. She warned him about the inevitable retribution for his sins, because the more serious the crime, the more terrible the punishment. Richard should have expected to be punished, for deep down he knew he deserved it. The perturbed man dropped everything and rushed to his ex-wife, hoping to prevent a tragedy. But upon arriving at her house, he realized he was too late. The love story of Richard and Jennifer began in 1990 at a party of mutual friends. The 27-year-old young man fell in love at first sight with the attractive 24-year-old blonde. A month later, they started dating. Richard was just starting his career as a realtor, while Jennifer worked as a nurse. Their modest incomes allowed them to rent a humble apartment in West Palm Beach, Florida, where the couple moved in 1991. Soon Richard proposed to his beloved, and she gladly accepted. In 1992, the lovers had a lavish wedding in Miami, believing that a long, happy married life awaited them. But reality proved to be harsher. The first years of the Bermans' married life were filled with joy and harmony. However, over time, their relationship was overshadowed by the husband's jealousy. Once, while visiting Jennifer at work, he witnessed her warm and caring interaction with one of her patients. Richard began to suspect that there was more than just medical care between his wife and the patient. Day by day, Richard's jealousy grew, and eventually he insisted that Jennifer quit her job at the hospital and become a housewife. At that point, his earnings had increased significantly, so his wife leaving her job did not affect the family's financial situation. At first, Jennifer felt awkward being completely dependent on her husband. But gradually she got used to her new role as a homemaker and found many interesting activities and hobbies for herself. In 1994, the couple took out a mortgage on a luxurious $1 million mansion in the prestigious historic district of Lisset, West Palm Beach. Jennifer enthusiastically set about arranging their new family nest. From the beginning of their marriage, the Bermans dreamed of having children, but for a long time their attempts were unsuccessful. Only in 1997, after long and expensive treatment, did Jennifer become pregnant. The long-awaited son Alex was born first in the family, followed by daughter Jacqueline a year later. The young mother adored her children and devoted herself entirely to raising them. Jennifer, an ardent fan of classical music, was pleased to note that her growing son and daughter shared her passion. At the ages of 6 to 7, Alex and Jacqueline began studying at the prestigious Alexander Dreyfus Public School of Arts in West Palm Beach. The Berman children showed remarkable musical talents. Alex masterfully played the cello, while straight-A student Jacqueline played the violin. At the same time, they excelled in their studies. Other parents held up Alex and Jacqueline as an example to their own children. Jennifer gave her all to raising her son and daughter. She drove them to school, picked them up after classes, and accompanied them to rehearsals and concerts. Alex and Jacqueline often performed as part of the school ensemble. Meanwhile, the head of the family, Richard Berman, fully devoted himself to work, providing a carefree life for his wife and children. And he succeeded at it. Step by step, he climbed the career ladder, and in 2005 he became the head of the real estate company where he had started as an intern 15 years earlier. But in 2007, the mortgage crisis hit America, leading to problems not only in the real estate market. The country was gripped by mass layoffs, falling stock prices, bank failures and other troubles. Richard's company survived, but his income dropped sharply. He could no longer single-handedly provide for his family at their accustomed level. And although the man had once promised his wife that she would never have to work again, due to financial difficulties he was forced to ask Jennifer to find a job, otherwise they risked losing their luxurious home. At that point, the woman had not worked anywhere for over 13 years. Having become so accustomed to the role of housewife, she immediately refused her husband's suggestion to return to the hospital. This caused tension in the couple's relationship. A year later, in 2008, Richard filed for divorce. This unexpected turn forced Jennifer to realize that after the divorce she would not be able to maintain her usual standard of living. So the woman agreed to get a job and started working as a nurse. Seeing this, Richard changed his mind about divorcing and withdrew his application. The couple continued to live together, but their relationship was no longer as happy as before. One of Jennifer's friends confessed, trust simply disappeared between them. Outwardly they seemed to be the same model family, but this was not the case. Jenny felt that her husband had betrayed her. She thought that Richard had deceived her, first by forcing her to quit, and then by making her go back to work. She stopped trusting him. As time passed, the effects of the crisis continued to impact the Bermans' financial situation. In 2010, they were forced to sell their luxurious mansion for $1.2 million to pay off their debts. They had to move to another mortgaged house in a less prestigious area of West Palm Beach. The couple grew further and further apart, effectively becoming roommates under one roof. They stayed together solely for the sake of the children. Richard did not hide his infidelities, while no one knew for sure whether Jennifer had any affairs on the side. Her husband's unfaithfulness was the last straw for the woman. In August 2012, she found out about Richard's young mistress. An outraged Jennifer filed for divorce and demanded that the cheater immediately get out of the house. But Richard was not going to back down and stated that he did not want a divorce. He was quite satisfied with the current relationship and had no intention of moving out of the house, for which he continued to pay the mortgage. The man bluntly warned his wife, "You won't get a cent from me. Don't expect me to leave you the house after the divorce and continue to pay the mortgage and alimony." The divorce proceedings dragged on for a long time, as neither Richard nor Jennifer wanted to compromise. They continued to live under the same roof in their shared home together with their son Alex and daughter Jacqueline. As it became known, all this time Richard made considerable efforts to get his wife to leave on her own. He staged debauches, provoked quarrels and swearing. Once, when the children were staying with their grandmother, the man brought prostitutes home and spent the night partying with them, forcing Jennifer, who was sleeping in the next room, to listen to their loud moans. The woman was shocked by her husband's behavior, not expecting such meanness from him. She went to the police with a complaint about emotional abuse by Richard. Jennifer hoped to get a court order restricting his contact with her and the children, but lost the case. Richard hired the best lawyers and defended his right to stay in the house with his wife. The only consolation in this situation was that the couple did not drag their son and daughter into their war. At least until the spring of 2013, when Richard threw another party with questionable guests. That's when Jennifer's patience ran out. She told her husband that she intended to move in with her mother along with the children. The elderly woman, who also lived in West Palm Beach, had extremely poor health. Almost all of her pension went to medicine and doctor visits. Jennifer realized that she could not expect help from her sick mother. Meanwhile, Richard continued to delay the divorce, which relieved him of the obligation to pay alimony. Thus, the entire burden of supporting Alex and Jacqueline fell on Jennifer's shoulders. It is known that in April 2013, the woman pawned a valuable watch that she had inherited from her late father. With the money she received, she bought clothes for the children and filled up her own car with gasoline. Jennifer was falling into despair. She refused the services of her lawyer in the divorce proceedings due to lack of funds. At the same time, she filed a petition with the court asking Richard to be obliged to provide her with financial assistance, but he remained adamant. Jennifer continued to work as a nurse at the hospital, coping quite well with her duties. However, due to financial difficulties, she had to take on additional side jobs. At night she cared for elderly people, working almost every day for 12 hours. At that time, the woman did not yet know what new trial fate had in store for her. In September 2013, Jennifer's mother's condition deteriorated sharply, and a few days later the elderly woman passed away. For Jennifer, who was already in a depressed state, her mother's death was a real shock. The woman sank into a deep depression and almost stopped going to work at the hospital. With her hands down, she watched her debts grow like a snowball. In November 2013, the Bermans officially divorced. Jennifer hoped that she would finally get half of the house and Richard would start paying alimony. She believed that her life would get better, but reality turned out to be completely different. By that time, Richard had begun to thrive in business. A successful realtor, he sold houses worth millions of dollars in South Florida. After the divorce, the man had to pay alimony to his ex-wife, but his official monthly income was only $2,888. So the court obliged him to pay the minimum amount, $600 for each child. In addition to alimony, the father also paid for medical insurance for Alex and Jacqueline and partially covered the costs of servicing Jennifer's car. As for the Bermans' shared home, Richard, using his connections in the real estate industry, delayed the process of selling it in every possible way. Jennifer could have expedited the deal by hiring lawyers, but she simply didn't have the money for it. Soon Richard bought a new posh house for $1.5 million and a luxurious Bentley. True, both purchases were registered to his real estate agency. However, it's worth giving Richard credit, he did not forget about his own children. The father showered Alex and Jacqueline with expensive gifts, took them to restaurants and various events. Perhaps in this way he tried to lure them to his new home. The man took every opportunity to show the teenagers that he could provide them with better living conditions. The confrontation between the ex-spouses was unequal. Jennifer's total monthly income barely reached $2,000. She paid for the children's elite art school, bought groceries, barely making ends meet. The woman had practically no money left for her own needs. Jennifer still lived with her son and daughter in her late mother's house. But soon another unpleasant surprise awaited her. It turned out that the old woman had once taken out a huge loan for treatment, putting the property up as collateral to the bank. She desperately fought for her life, unfortunately hiding this information from her daughter. In December 2013, Jennifer received a letter from the bank notifying her that in February 2014 she had to vacate the house, which the institution was taking in payment of the debt. After these events, sinister thoughts began to surface in Jennifer's mind. At the end of 2013, the woman, along with Alex and Jacqueline, moved out of her late mother's house into their old empty dwelling, where once the entire Berman family had happily lived together. One pre-New Year's Day, Jennifer was talking to a friend, complaining about fatigue and loss of meaning in life. The friend advised her to immediately see a psychiatrist. Jennifer heeded the advice and visited a doctor who recommended a course of psychotherapy. However, she had neither the money nor the time for it, so the treatment was limited to prescribing antidepressants. Unfortunately, these medications could not improve the woman's psycho-emotional state. And the last straw was Alex and Jacqueline's statement that they wanted a better life and wished to move in with their father. Immediately after the onset of the new year 2014, in the first days of January, Jennifer gathered all the available funds, purchased a hunting rifle, a silencer, and ammunition. On the night of January 12th to 13th, the woman waited for her son and daughter to fall sound asleep. Taking the weapon, she first went to Alex's room and then to Jacqueline's. After that, she sent a message to her ex-husband with the words, "You deserve this," and pulled the trigger for the third time. Richard read the message only a few hours later. He tried to call Jennifer, but no one picked up. The man instantly got ready, got into the car and rushed to his ex-wife. At that moment, the clock showed about 8 a.m. On the way, Richard called 911. Despite the dispatcher's repeated warnings to wait for the police, he entered the house and saw a horrific scene. Going up to Alex's bedroom, the man heard the alarm clock ringing, but his son lay motionless in bed. Coming closer, Richard saw blood flowing from the boy's ear. He refused to believe his eyes. In his daughter's bedroom, the father found Jacqueline, who was also lying in bed with a gunshot wound to the head. Her face was horribly mutilated. Jennifer was found in the kitchen. Blood splatters were visible on the walls, a rifle lying nearby. 2 empty wine bottles stood on the glass round table. There Richard also found a note written by his ex-wife, "I sympathize with those who loved us and who are now in pain." It seems that before this, Jennifer had sent an email to her cousin, with whom she was close. The woman wrote to him that she had no more strength to fight life's adversities, so she intended to take her own life, taking her son and daughter with her. The police officers who arrived at the scene confirmed that all 3 were dead. At the time of death, Alex was 16, Jacqueline was 15, and their mother was 48 years old. Studying the court documents regarding the divorce, law enforcement officials learned that Jennifer had repeatedly complained about her husband, who had left her without means of subsistence. The woman said that she was forced to sell personal belongings in order to buy groceries. The deceased's statement also indicated that during the divorce, when the couple was still living under the same roof, Richard bought food and personal items for himself and then hid them in his room so that his wife and children could not use them. Jennifer claimed that her husband hid even toilet paper from them. After separating from Richard, Jennifer's monthly expenses amounted to about $4,500, while her income was half that amount. Thus, the woman's debts grew steadily every month. It is known that during the divorce proceedings, Richard stopped paying the mortgage on their shared home. After the divorce, Jennifer planned to sell the property for $590,000, but the house was mortgaged. According to court documents, Jennifer's total debt to banks exceeded $600,000. Relatives saw this as the very reason for the terrible tragedy that befell the Berman family. The deceased's cousin, who prefers to remain anonymous, said that his sister had had unhealthy thoughts before. In his opinion, Jennifer simply convinced herself that she could not cope with life's difficulties and gave up. She did not intend to take revenge, but thought she was doing the right thing. She just didn't see a future. "This is real madness," the cousin commented on Jennifer's tragedy. According to the Berman's neighbors, both Jennifer and Richard were good parents. They rarely quarreled, but when it came to divorce, conflicts and scandals really broke out between them. One of the neighbors reported that 2 days before the tragedy, he saw and talked to Jennifer. She was sad and upset, and something strange could be discerned in her face. As if it wasn't her, and her eyes seemed empty. Jennifer offered to sell their house to the neighbor at a reduced price. The woman was eager to get money as soon as possible in order to pay off her debts. And at the end of the conversation, she let slip, "I'm ready to go to a new world." The neighbor said goodbye to Jennifer and soon told his wife about this strange conversation, expressing concern. But his wife believed that they should not interfere in other people's family affairs. Richard Berman took the loss of his son and daughter hard. According to some sources, for a while he became dependent on alcohol, but later got a grip on himself. In one interview, Richard admitted, "This is horrible and crazy. Once Jennifer was a good wife, a wonderful mother, but the divorce deprived her of her mind. Wanting to take revenge on me, she struck at the most painful spot. This is the most selfish and monstrous crime one can imagine." In 2015, Richard Berman suddenly came into several $1,000,000. With this money, he founded a fund to support talented students of the Dreyfus School of the Arts, where his children had once studied. This fund is still functioning today. It is known that Richard Berman is now about 60 years old. The man is married, still lives in his luxurious mansion, and runs a real estate company in West Palm Beach. Life changed dramatically when she became a mother at the tender age of 14. Despite the fact that her mom, Gloria Vydner, took the news hard, she didn't turn her back on her daughter and continued to support her. However, no one could have imagined that an even greater tragedy would befall their family a couple years later. Emmy was born in 1973 into the Vydner family, where in addition to her, 3 other children were being raised, an older brother, John Paul, who had just turned 1 at the time, and 2 younger sisters, 1 and 4 years her junior, respectively. Gloria, the children's mother, had to be the sole breadwinner and caregiver for them, as she had long been divorced from her husband, who did not help raise their shared offspring in any way. The Vydner family lived in a small house of their own in the state of Indiana. Emmy was her mom's main helper. The girl cooked meals, cleaned, and looked after her little sisters. At the same time, she took her studies very seriously, dreaming of becoming a teacher in the future. Everyone who knew Emmy associated her with a cheerful, bright, outgoing girl whose smile was captivating. And then one day, when Emmy had just barely turned 14, she got pregnant. At first, she was afraid to confess this to her mother, so for about 5.5 months, she hid her condition, concealing her belly under loose clothing. None of her relatives even suspected she was pregnant. However, when almost half a year had passed, Emmy's rounded belly became so noticeable that it was no longer possible to keep it a secret. Then the girl mustered up the courage, went to her mother and, sobbing bitterly, told her the truth. Emmy admitted that she was very worried about the pregnancy, and through tears said, "Mom, I don't want you to hate me." Gloria, embracing her daughter, soothed her and assured her of her support, although deep down she felt confusion and despair. "I was shocked and simply couldn't believe it. It seemed to me that this was the worst thing that could happen in my life," the woman shared, recalling her emotions at the time. She had no idea that real grief was still ahead. As it turned out, the father of Emmy's child was 17-year-old Tony Abercrombie, a buddy of her older brother. The lovers met in secret, keeping their relationship hidden from relatives. Upon learning of her daughter's pregnancy, Gloria immediately forbade her from seeing Tony and set a strict condition, to completely break off relations with the father of the future child. News of young Emmy Vydner's pregnancy quickly spread throughout the district. Classmates, teachers, friends, neighbors, they all supported the girl and tried to help her in every way possible. Emmy was worried that she would have to miss school classes due to the approaching birth and that this would negatively affect her academic performance. Therefore, even while pregnant, she continued to go to school every day, and moreover, she arrived earlier than everyone else and diligently mastered new material. On October 25, 1987, Emmy Vydner gave birth to a girl, whom she named Emily. And just 6 days after giving birth, she returned to her school desk, albeit now in the status of a young mother. Realizing how important it was for her daughter to get a good education, Gloria helped her in every way possible, often staying with her little granddaughter. At the same time, the woman remembered that Emmy was still a teenager, so she did not forbid her from meeting with friends or going out. And the girl, despite her young maternal status, continued to be one of the best students in the school, earning teachers' approval for her diligence and hard work. Mother and daughter coped wonderfully with little Emily, taking turns caring for her. A year passed like this, then another. It seemed that life had returned to its usual course. Emmy had coped with the difficulties and was moving on. But one day, everything changed abruptly. The morning of November 13, 1989 began for 16-year-old Emmy Vydner with a severe sore throat. The girl told her mother that she would stay home with Emily and skip today's school classes. Gloria wanted to take her 2-year-old granddaughter to a nanny, but Emmy refused. After breakfast, each family member went about their business. Gloria went to work, while Emmy's brother and sisters went to school. Emmy and Emily were left home alone. Around 9:30, the worried mother called her daughter, but she didn't answer. When a couple hours later the calls again went unanswered, Gloria asked a neighbor to go and check if everything was okay. However, the woman returned empty-handed. No one opened the door at the Vydner's house, and inside there was complete silence. This alarmed Gloria, so she took time off work and rushed home. Opening the front door, the woman saw little Emily sitting alone on the stairs. Emmy did not respond to her mother's calls. Going up to the second floor, to her daughter's bedroom, Gloria froze in horror. Emmy, completely naked, was lying on the bed in a pool of blood, lifeless. Her mother immediately called 911. The police officers who arrived at the scene, during their inspection of the Vydner house, assumed that an attempted burglary had taken place here. The stereo system and graphic equalizer belonging to John Paul, Emmy's older brother, were missing. Emmy's own piggy bank with money had also disappeared from the girl's room, an ordinary glass jar in which Emmy had been saving about $50 for school needs. At the same time, no traces of the intruder's entry into the house were found. Most likely, he got inside either through the unlocked back door, or through the front entrance, where Emmy herself let him in. In the girl's room, criminologists found many pieces of material evidence left by the killer: semen on the bedding, a bloody handprint on the wall, and several hairs. The medical examiner established that Emmy Vydner was first hit on the head with a sharp object, then strangled. It's terrifying to imagine that little Emily could have been somewhere nearby at that time and witnessed this entire horror with her own eyes. Fortunately, the child was not touched. Law enforcement officers tried to talk to 2-year-old Emily, trying to find out at least some details of that fatal day from her. The little one ran from one wall to the other, repeating only one thing: her mother, as she called Emmy, was very angry that day. The police carefully collected all the potential evidence. They cut out a section of the wall with the killer's bloody handprint, and seized the victim's clothing and bedding. The investigation began with questioning the relatives, friends, and neighbors of the Vydner family. The victim's brother, 17-year-old John Paul, said during the interrogation that the investigators even tried to accuse him, but the young man had an ironclad alibi, and the physical evidence did not confirm his involvement in the crime. Emmy's ex-boyfriend, the father of little Emily, Tony Abercrombie, also fell under suspicion. However, during the interrogation, he confessed his sincere feelings for the girl and assured that he never wished her any harm. On the day of the tragedy, Tony was at work, which was confirmed by an indisputable alibi. The police's attention was also drawn to another friend of Emmy's, Troy Jackson, who lived near the Vydner's house. According to the cops, the guy allegedly knew the whereabouts of the equipment stolen on the day of the murder. However, during the interrogation, Troy denied any involvement in the crime. No traces of a struggle were found on his body, neither bruises nor scratches. Troy's hair, provided for examination, did not match the samples found at the crime scene. In addition, the guy successfully passed a lie detector test, so the suspicions against him were dropped. Investigators also interrogated other acquaintances of Emmy, classmates, neighbors. Fingerprints and hair samples were taken from each of them for analysis, but none of these people ever became a suspect. Soon, Emmy Vydner's funeral took place, which was attended by many local residents. The death of the young girl became an irreparable loss for the entire community. The detectives were also present at the funeral, closely observing each of the attendees. One of the most charming photos of Emmy, where she is smiling, in her favorite white turtleneck with a pattern, became her last lifetime portrait. It was in this outfit that the girl was buried. The grief-stricken mother, Gloria Vydner, hoped for a quick solving of the crime and severe punishment for the killer, but weeks and months passed, and there were still no suspects. After her daughter's death, Gloria officially adopted her granddaughter Emily and took on the role of her mother. The woman couldn't find peace. Thoughts of the uncaught criminal haunted her, because she trembled with horror that he might return and harm the rest of her children. From then on, Gloria did not leave her younger daughters alone. Her heart ached at the thought that the killer was still at large. She thought about moving to another house, away from the terrible memories, but the family's difficult financial situation did not allow it. It was an extremely difficult period for the Vydner family. Emmy's friends confessed that they begged their parents to board up the windows, fearing that the maniac could break into their homes in the same way as it happened with Emmy. Once, Gloria returned home from work and, knowing that her younger daughters should have already been home from school, entered the house. However, no one greeted her. Inside, there was an ominous silence, although the children's shoes were neatly standing in their usual place. Terrible thoughts flashed through Gloria's head, and she rushed to the second floor. The steps leading to the children's bedroom seemed endless. The woman hesitated for a moment in front of the door, but, grabbing the air, abruptly opened it. Fortunately, the girls were just sleeping peacefully. The years passed. Emily, Emmy's daughter, grew up. Fortunately, she did not remember the tragedy that happened to her biological mother. The girl did not recall either the police questioning or the moment when she was told about her mother's death. From time to time, detectives visited the Vydners, forcing them to relive the events of that fatal day over and over again. An exhausted Gloria admitted that at some point she got tired of it all, and she wanted only one thing: for them to finally leave her alone and let her live on, because Emmy would not return. In 2002, 13 years after the murder, a new lead suddenly appeared in the case. A 29-year-old man called the Indianapolis Police Department and told about his dream. In the dream, Emmy Vydner allegedly appeared to him and revealed the details of what had happened to her. Many of the details from his story coincided with what had previously been reported in the news. The cops carefully checked this man, and it turned out that at the time of the crime he was 16 years old and lived across the street from the Vydner's house. The fingerprints and DNA sample taken from him for analysis did not match, so he had to be released. Although the testimony did not play any role in the investigation, this call prompted the detectives to stir up the long-cold case again. That same year, 2002, investigators re-interrogated some of Emmy's inner circle, especially those who had had problems with the law in the 13 years since her death. However, the investigation again reached a dead end. In 2011, Emmy's friends created a Facebook group called Remembering Emmy Vydner. The detective who was assigned to investigate this old case was not very familiar with Facebook, so he asked a colleague, Bill Carter, to print out the group's page. Bill Carter became interested in this story, and although he had never investigated murders before, but only dealt with economic crimes, he decided to delve into Emmy's case. He became so engrossed in studying the materials of this old case in his free time that he could not tear himself away. Carter scrupulously studied every page of the case, every piece of physical evidence, information about school attendance on the day of the murder, and lists of those present at the girl's funeral. After entering all the data into an electronic database, he realized that the previous investigators had missed several leads. It turned out that there were several friends of Emmy's brother with whom the police had never even spoken and whose DNA samples were not checked. In 2011, Detective Bill Carter intensified his work on the Emmy Vydner murder case. He contacted the girl's family and her friends, questioning everyone who might have any information about the victim. Carter also began recollecting DNA samples from individuals whom the police had excluded from the circle of suspects at the initial stages of the investigation. Immediately after the crime in 1989, law enforcement officers carefully combed the entire area where the Vydners lived and still reside, writing down the names of all their neighbors. Armed with this data, Detective Carter set off along the same route to check if any of these people still lived at their old addresses. Carter was lucky to find one of the neighbors, a friend of Emmy's, who lived across the street from the house where the murder took place. The woman strained her memory, trying to recall the names of the guys Emmy was friends with. For the most part, she named names that were already known to the police and had been checked, but suddenly she remembered one that Carter had never heard of before: Ronnie Dean. In 2012, Detective Bill Carter, with the support of the Unsolved Crimes Unit, officially began working on the Emmy Vydner case. He considered it his duty to find this Ronnie Dean by any means necessary and either exclude him from the list of suspects or prove his guilt. It turned out that the Vydner family was well acquainted with Ronnie Dean. He was friends with John Paul, Emmy's older brother. The guys often hung out together, riding bicycles or going fishing. When Carter asked John Paul what Ronnie was like, he described him as an unsociable loner who always kept to himself. No one would have ever suspected him of anything bad. The detective paid a visit to the home of 40-year-old Ronnie Dean, which was located next door to the Vydner's house. There the man lived with his mother. Ronnie himself worked at an auto parts store. His marriage had long since broken up, and he actually did not participate in raising his already adult son. When Carter came to Dean's dwelling, his mother opened the door, informing him that her son was currently at work. The detective left the woman his business card, asking Ronnie to call him as soon as he returned home. And indeed, that same evening, Dean personally contacted Carter. The detective immediately suggested meeting and talking about the old case of the murder of young Emmy Vydner. Ronnie agreed and invited Carter to his home. But when the detective arrived at the scene, Ronnie was no longer there. Then Carter decided to check Dean through the DNA database, and found out that he had previously been held responsible for a beating in 1991 and theft in 1997. His fingerprints were stored in the database. Carter sent them for examination along with the cast of the bloody palm print found on the wall of the Vydner's house. This was supposed to be a routine procedure aimed at removing any suspicion from Dean. The results of the examination were stunning. Ronnie's fingerprints completely matched the palm print left at the crime scene. 23 years had passed, and now, finally, a real suspect appeared in the Emmy Vydner murder case. But the euphoria quickly turned to disappointment. It turned out that by that time, Dean had already disappeared, having stopped appearing at home. The police launched a massive manhunt for the fugitive. It soon became known that Ronnie had rented a car, using his credit card to do so. Fortunately, the car was equipped with the OnStar satellite tracking system, thanks to which the cops were able to track down Dean's whereabouts quite quickly. He was hiding at a friend's place in the same state of Indiana. When one day Ronnie was about to get into his rented car, police officers approached him. Noticing them, the agitated man pulled out a knife and began yelling, "I didn't do it." He managed to cut his wrist, and then rushed at the cops. They twisted his arm, using a taser, put handcuffs on him and took him to the hospital for medical assistance. Ronnie was interrogated in the hospital for 2 days. Everything took place under the sights of video cameras. Dean almost immediately confessed that he was to blame for the death of Emmy Vydner. According to him, he only wanted to rob a neighboring house and could not even imagine that Emmy would be at home and catch him red-handed. Ronnie had no idea that the girl had fallen ill and did not go to school on that fateful day. Dean said that he got into the Vydner's house through the unlocked back sliding doors. Going up to John Paul's room, he was going to steal a stereo system from there. It was at this moment that Emmy suddenly approached him. Frightened, Ronnie grabbed some object that was the first to come to hand and hit the girl on the head, and then killed her. For 2 days, Dean retold his story, constantly complaining that over the 23 years that had passed since then, his memories had faded and he poorly remembered the details. At some point, he even stated that he went to the Vydner's house not alone, but with an accomplice named Buck. However, Ronnie was unable to remember what he looked like or describe him in detail. According to his version, Buck remained outside and watched the house, and then went inside, and together they dealt with the girl. When investigators asked if he had seen little Emily, Dean replied that he had not noticed the child and had not even heard her crying. He had no idea that at that time, the little one was somewhere very close by. Throughout all these conversations with investigators and detectives, Ronnie behaved amazingly calmly and politely. He did not cry or shout. Despite what he had done, he did not look like a killer at all. Perhaps the time gap that had passed since then had an effect. Dean provided a sample of his DNA, which, not surprisingly, completely matched the traces of semen found in 1989 on Emmy Vydner's sheet and blanket. "I always try to be a good person, but it seems that somewhere deep down, I'm not a good person at all," Ronnie confessed to the detectives. Both the bloody palm print and the genetic material belonged to him. No evidence was found that the crime was committed in complicity. The Vydner family, having learned the terrible truth about Emmy's killer, could not recover from the shock for a long time. It was difficult for them to believe that the quiet and unremarkable Ronnie was capable of such cruelty. After all, this guy grew up and studied side by side with John Paul, was his friend, and lived across the street from their home. He often visited them as a guest both before and after the tragedy, was present at Emmy's funeral, and mourned her death along with everyone else and supported Gloria. Later, Detective Carter found Dean's signature in the book of condolences at Emmy's funeral. But the fact that Ronnie's name had appeared in the case back in 2003 became known only during the re-examination of it. It was then that the girl's former lover and the father of little Emily, Tony Abercrombie, let slip that Dean often visited the Vydners. Carter suggested that in 1989, Ronnie simply went unnoticed. He was forgotten. For some reason no one ever interrogated him then. Researchers studying Dean's biography in 2012 came across another chilling fact from his life. It turned out that Ronnie's own son, Dylan Dean, was serving a sentence in prison for murder. In 2009, at the age of 16, he brutally beat his own mother, Mary Maginry, with a baseball bat. The woman died from her injuries. The boy claimed that she had mocked him, insulted him, and he could not stand it. Dylan had barely turned 17 when, a few days after the deed, he suffered the same fate as Ronnie once did. His father killed Emmy Vydner when he was 18. Both father and son committed high-profile crimes at practically the same age. The detectives were struck by this eerie discovery. Ironically, Ronnie had hardly participated in the boy's upbringing. He divorced Mary quite quickly, leaving her alone with the child. He only came to his son's trial and gave testimony. In 2009, Dylan agreed to a plea deal, pleading guilty, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He will be released in 2029, when he turns 37. But let's return to the Emmy Vydner case. For a long time, Ronnie Dean insisted that he had committed the crime not alone, but with an accomplice named Buck. And only in June 2013, just 10 days before the trial, 42-year-old Ronnie stated that he had killed Emmy on his own, without anyone's help. In the end, he was sentenced to 65 years in prison. After the crime was solved in 2013, the Vydner family met with Detective Bill Carter to thank him for his brilliant work. It was he who was able to find out the killer's name just 12 days after taking on this case and bring the investigation to its logical conclusion. In memory of Emmy, 24 balloons were released into the sky, one for each year the family had lived without her. In January 2014, Detective Carter received an honorary award from the Indianapolis Police Department. He was offered a transfer to the Homicide Investigation Unit, but the man decided to stay in his current position. Emily Vydner grew up. She graduated from the same school as her mother Emmy, then received a university education. Aspiring to broaden her horizons and find more opportunities for self-realization, the girl moved from Indianapolis to California. Gloria Vydner, Emmy's mother, admitted that she still misses her daughter every day. She still lives in the house where the murder took place. Emmy's room still holds her photographs, and from time to time Gloria's grandchildren, who come to their grandmothers for the holidays, stay there. Then the cozy girl's room is again filled with children's laughter and bright smiles. 3. A resident of the small English village of Basing in Lincolnshire decided to take a stroll along the River Witham with his loyal dog. The man was genuinely enjoying the tranquility and picturesque landscapes of the countryside when suddenly the idyll was disrupted by his pet, who brought a white grocery store bag in its teeth and placed it at its master's feet. The bag emitted a rather unpleasant odor, so the man assumed that it likely contained spoiled meat, which had attracted the dog's attention. Upon untying the knot, he saw a chilling find and immediately called the police. Within half an hour, officers arrived at the scene. The bag contained a severed human hand. The police promptly summoned divers to search the river. By the end of the day, 17 more similar bags were retrieved from the bottom of the Witham and sent for examination to a forensic center in London. It took the experts a full 13 hours to assemble the puzzle of 224 body parts. Such horrifying discoveries indicated that law enforcement was dealing with an extremely brutal criminal who was likely well versed in anatomy and could be connected to the medical field. According to the medical examiner's report, the victim turned out to be a young woman aged approximately 20 to 30 years old. Her death had occurred about a week prior. The body lacked any distinctive features, tattoos, birthmarks, or scars that could aid in identifying the deceased. After thoroughly searching the riverbank and surrounding area, the police found no further evidence. Next, the detectives began checking lists of missing persons, trying to find matches with the parameters of the discovered victim. The description fit 26-year-old Holly Mason, who had last been seen by her relatives 6 days earlier, on March 20th. Although the girl was married, it was not her husband but her parents, the Bramleys, who contacted the police. They had noticed changes in their daughter's behavior as early as March 17th, when she stopped answering calls, limiting herself to only messages, and Holly's communication style abruptly changed. The parents said that their daughter had suddenly begun writing to them rudely, telling them to leave her alone. "We immediately felt something was wrong. Holly had always been a very kind girl and would never express herself like that," they noted. Identifying the mutilated body was not possible, so DNA testing had to be used, which dispelled all doubts. The victim of the crime was indeed Holly Mason, who lived in the city of Lincoln, just 7 kilometers from the site of the gruesome discovery. The girl resided with her 28-year-old husband, Nicholas. Holly was born in 1997 into a large family, being one of triplets. In total, the family had as many as 13 children, with whom the girl had surprisingly warm relationships. After finishing school, Holly enrolled in a medical college in Boston, intending to become a nurse. It was there, in 2016, while in her second year, that she met fourth-year student Nicholas Mason, who was studying to be a general practitioner. Little is known about Nicholas' childhood years, except that in 2013, at the age of 17, he was convicted of assaulting a girl, and 3 years later, in 2016, the young man again found himself in the dock. This time, Mason was sentenced to a suspended term for posting photos of his girlfriend online without her consent. This was how Nicholas took revenge on his ex for breaking up with him. After the verdict, the young man was expelled from medical college. Meanwhile, he and Holly developed a close relationship and began dating. The girl was not at all frightened by either Nicholas' dark past or his Asperger's syndrome. The young man, kicked out of college, got a job at a meat processing plant. In 2018, when Holly completed her studies and began working as a nurse at a clinic in Lincoln, Nicholas proposed to his beloved. On September 18, 2021, the couple had a modest wedding. The newlyweds settled on the 14th floor of an apartment building in a residential area of Lincoln, occupying a small 2-room flat. Holly understood that life with Nicholas would not be easy. Asperger's syndrome has many manifestations. In Mason's case, the disorder made the man obsessed with the idea of total control. He incessantly monitored his wife's every move, demanding that she report her every action down to the smallest detail, including what she ate, what medications she took, and what color socks she wore. Nicholas severely limited Holly's communication with her parents, brothers, sisters, and friends. The girl rarely saw her relatives, occasionally chatting by phone or on social media. While studying in college, Holly had worked for some time as a nurse at a center for children with autistic disorders, so she had experience communicating with people who suffer from similar conditions. The girl learned to ignore some of Nicholas' quirks, and sometimes tried to calm her husband with assurances of boundless love. At first, this approach yielded results, but over time, Nicholas' behavior became increasingly inadequate. It seemed that Holly's angelic patience only fueled her husband's desire for absolute control over every aspect of her life. In the fall of 2022, Nicholas suddenly began to think that Holly was overly concerned about their dog. One day, the man allegedly did not notice how the animal crawled into the washing machine, after which the appliance turned on and began a washing cycle. Moreover, Nicholas deliberately arranged everything so that it was Holly who stumbled upon the dead pet. Unfortunately, it did not end there. A similar fate befell the hamsters that Holly got after the dog's death. Nicholas claimed that the unclean rodents had escaped from the cage on their own. One climbed into the microwave, and the other into the bowl of the blender. Both hamsters died. It was then that Holly realized that Nicholas was insane and she needed to escape from him immediately. In December 2022, the frightened girl told her best friend not only about the death of the pets but also about other alarming incidents. Her friend pleaded with Holly, "Get out while you still can. Are you still hesitating about whether to leave him?" However, Holly only managed to leave her husband 4 months later. The last straw was when in March 2023, Nicholas cooked their decorative rabbit for dinner. 16 months had passed since the wedding when Holly finally decided to leave Nicholas, who by that time had already scared her to death, constantly babbling that nothing and no one could ever separate them. Holly's parents recalled that their daughter adored her younger brothers, nephews, and nieces, and dreamed above all of becoming a mother. The girl fervently wanted to have her own children. However, Nicholas was by no means fit for the role of a father. Holly had planned to divorce him back in early 2023 but unfortunately kept postponing this decision. On March 18, 2023, Holly did not show up for work, and since her phone was not answering, the head nurse called Nicholas to find out if his wife was all right. The man replied, "Didn't she tell you that we broke up? Last night Holly packed her bags and left. I have no idea where she is now." Obviously, Nicholas told the same story to his wife's parents, who also could not get through to their daughter. Over the next 2 days, Holly's relatives and friends called all her acquaintances, but none of them knew with whom or where the young woman had gone. Finally, on March 20th, Holly's parents went to the police station and filed a missing person report for their daughter. The next day, investigators summoned Nicholas Mason to the station and asked him to recount when and under what circumstances he had last seen his wife. This is what the man replied: "It happened on March 17 or 18. Holly packed her things and left. I saw through the window that she was being escorted by 2 men, so I assumed she was having an affair, and judging by everything, it had been going on for a long time. I didn't want to disclose this and make a fuss." When asked why he hadn't contacted the police, Nicholas explained that since Holly had not returned home, their marriage had de facto ceased to exist, and therefore, he was no longer concerned with this woman's life. During the interrogation, Nicholas remained extremely calm, but he noticeably grew nervous as soon as the detectives inquired when they could inspect his home, and he very reluctantly agreed to a search. Before entering the apartment, one of the officers double-checked, "Are you absolutely certain that Holly is not at home?" Nicholas replied with a mocking smile, "I'm 100% sure she's not there, but if you don't trust my word, check for yourself, maybe she's hiding under the bed." While examining the dwelling, the detectives found that Holly's belongings were indeed almost gone, but their attention was drawn to something else. In all the rooms, there was a strong smell of bleach, and bloody tissues lay in the kitchen garbage can. When the police demanded an explanation from Nicholas, he replied that during their last meeting, Holly had bitten him and showed teeth marks on his arm as proof. As strange as Mason's explanation sounded, at that point, the investigators had no grounds to detain him. The detectives visited Nicholas again a few days later when it was discovered that the mutilated female corpse found in the Witham belonged to Holly Mason, who had been missing for over a week. For some reason, the surveillance cameras in the building where the couple lived had failed 2 days before Holly's disappearance. Someone had cut the cable. However, the police managed to find footage from cameras on a neighboring building, which recorded Holly entering the entrance on March 17, 2023, with a bag of fish in her hands. After that, the girl did not leave the house again. Nicholas Mason was immediately taken into custody, and forensic experts conducted a thorough search of the dwelling. Although the man had carefully cleaned the apartment, generously using bleach, the experts still managed to detect traces of Holly's blood in the bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. Judging by the evidence found, it all started with a conflict in the bedroom, after which Holly tried to hide from Nicholas in the kitchen, but unfortunately, the girl was attacked there as well. Nicholas took the life of his wife and then, using the skills acquired while working at a meat processing plant, dismembered her body in the bathroom, packed it into bags, and began to ponder his next steps. He attached a note to the front door and locked himself in the apartment. The message stated that the residents of the dwelling had coronavirus, so please do not disturb. On the same day, Nicholas took possession of Holly's phone and began sending messages to her loved ones and friends. Pretending to be the girl, he wrote that she had harmed herself, after which she was taken to a psychiatric clinic, from where she escaped to Manchester. Nicholas also claimed on Holly's behalf that she had treated her husband badly. He transferred money from his wife's bank account to his own and later withdrew it at the nearest ATM. When Holly's relatives became worried a few days later, Nicholas realized that he needed to get rid of the bags and thoroughly clean the dwelling. So he contacted his longtime school friend Joshua Hancock and asked for help. Nicholas promised to pay his buddy £50 sterling, which is approximately $60. 27-year-old Joshua had mental disabilities and, like Nicholas, suffered from Asperger's syndrome. However, unlike his friend, Hancock had a very low level of intelligence. Joshua had a passion for substances and lived with his parents. In January 2023, the young man came to the attention of the police after he began communicating with minors on the internet. He invited them to visit, sending his home address, but instead of young girls, law enforcement officers came to him. Here is the video footage of that moment. Joshua pretended not to understand what was happening. The young man was placed under investigation, and just 3 months after this incident, he helped Nicholas get rid of the bags containing the remains of Holly Mason's body. Nicholas bought a large trolley. In the apartment, he loaded 18 bags into it, took them outside, transferred them to the trunk of his car, then picked up his friend, and the two of them headed to the river. After dumping the bags, the buddies returned to the dwelling, where they started a thorough cleaning. Nicholas paid Joshua the promised £50, after which he went home. Literally a couple of hours later, Hancock sent a message to another acquaintance, boasting that he had received £50 for helping to dispose of a corpse, and he also took a photo with the banknote and posted it online. The caption under the photo read, "Girls, call me, I haven't had intimacy for a long time." A few days later, Joshua deleted this post. Meanwhile, Nicholas continued to stay in the apartment, not opening the door to anyone and using the internet. In the search engine, he entered queries such as, "What assistance can I expect in the event of my wife's death? Can bleach destroy fingerprints? Can a person's ghost haunt me after their death? Does God forgive murders?" In the spring of 2024, Nicholas Mason appeared in court and fully admitted his guilt. On April 5, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with the right to parole after 19 years. Nicholas not only killed his wife but also made every effort to hide her body and make it impossible to find. By this, he demonstrated his immorality and cruelty, and therefore, he deservedly ended up behind bars to realize the gravity of what he had done and atone for his guilt. His accomplice Joshua Hancock also pleaded guilty. According to witnesses, Joshua repented more for what he had done than Nicholas did. Hancock received 3 years in prison and was also entered into the register of persons who committed crimes for a period of 10 years. Holly's grief-stricken parents admitted that their daughter's death had become a real tragedy for the entire family. The mother and father of the deceased hope that Nicholas will remain behind bars for life and never be released again. Castleton was born in 1966 in the picturesque city of Salt Lake City, located in the state of Utah, USA. She had an inseparable older sister, Paula, with whom she maintained a close bond throughout her life. In 1994, at the age of 28, Shona fulfilled her long-held dream and moved to Las Vegas, a city that beckoned her with its endless opportunities. Initially, she found a job as a saleswoman in a cosmetic store, but this was merely a stepping stone to something greater. Shona was enticed by the vibrant nightlife of Las Vegas, where big money, success, and wealth reigned supreme. Fortune smiled upon her when she was offered a position as a waitress at one of the most prestigious casinos, Pawns. Shona quickly won over her colleagues and guests with her attractive appearance and friendly demeanor. Her co-workers became like a second family to her. Always smiling, radiant, and full of life, Shona earned the nickname Barbie from her loved ones for her charming smile, blonde hair, and model-like looks. She absolutely adored this job, and the customers simply loved her. Moreover, her salary of $100,000 per year was more than decent. However, the Pawns Casino not only provided Shona with financial stability and good friends but also true love. It was here in 2002 that she met her future husband, George Tiafi. It was love at first sight. George was an incredibly attractive, charismatic, and charming guy. At the time, he worked as a firefighter and selflessly helped people. George deeply valued his family and sent part of his salary home every month to support his mother, who was caring for his younger sister with a disability. George's incredible looks even brought him fame as a model. His photos graced the calendar of the fire department. Together, they made a remarkably harmonious and striking couple, radiating happiness and love. From their very first meeting, Shona and George became inseparable, and soon decided to live together. Just a year later, they welcomed a baby girl, Madison, who became Shona's true purpose in life. While her husband put out fires, she fully devoted herself to raising their daughter and taking care of the household. 3 years later, the couple had a fairy tale wedding in Hawaii, right on the ocean shore, surrounded by their closest loved ones. Shona's life seemed like a magical fairy tale. However, this story, unfortunately, would not have a happy ending. 2 years later, the family went through a difficult period. George suffered serious financial losses after making an ill-fated investment in real estate. To support the family, Shona had to return to work and become the main breadwinner, while her husband, exhausted by his failures, fell into a prolonged depression. George struggled with the lack of a stable income, but at that time, he could do nothing about it. Instead, he began to be jealous of his wife and expressed dissatisfaction with her revealing outfits at work. But Shona couldn't dress differently, as her profession demanded such a dress code. The tension in their relationship gradually grew. The situation escalated further when George befriended a homeless man and started bringing him home. Shona found this man creepy and he terrified her. George had helped the homeless before, but he had never invited them into their house. Now, he had crossed the line. Her husband's antics finally pushed Shona over the edge. Concerned for her own safety and that of her daughter, after almost 10 years of living together, she moved out from George and settled into a separate apartment in a townhouse. Shona was devastated and depressed by the breakdown of her family, which did not go unnoticed by her loved ones. However, being an optimist by nature, she hoped that she and George would be able to save their marriage. Her husband also did not want a divorce. The couple even started seeing a family psychotherapist, trying to preserve their relationship. However, this did not bring the desired results. Too many mutual grievances and recriminations had accumulated between them. Eventually, Shona decided to file for divorce. The former spouses began a legal battle for custody of their daughter. Shona immersed herself in her work, which, along with spending time with Madison, remained her only solace and a way to distract herself from her family troubles. But in early September 2012, something unexpected happened. Upon returning home from work one day, Shona noticed that someone had been in the house. There was chaos everywhere, and some valuable items were missing, including her wedding ring. But the strangest thing was that along with the valuables, her bikini had also disappeared. Instead, the intruder left a pair of small men's boxers in the apartment. The police immediately noted that this was not at all like a typical burglary. Shona was horrified by the invasion of her home but decided not to escalate the situation. The woman had no idea that by a fatal coincidence, exactly 3 weeks later, someone would visit her home again, but this time with much more sinister intentions. On September 29, 2012, Shona left work as usual, around 3 in the morning. At 3:30, she parked her car in the garage, went up to her apartment, and closed the door behind her. After that, no one ever saw her alive again. The next morning, after finishing his 24-hour shift, George went to pick up 8-year-old Madison from her grandmother's house, so that he and his daughter could then go to Shona's place to get the girls' things. The garage and apartment doors were suspiciously open. And when they went inside, they saw complete disarray, with things scattered everywhere. But the most horrific sight awaited them in the room. In the middle of a pool of blood lay Shona's lifeless body. A stunned George called 911 and reported the gruesome discovery. The police immediately rushed to the crime scene and began investigating this brutal murder. An examination of the body showed that Shona had been subjected to an extremely brutal attack. Her skull was almost crushed, so at first, the police and medics assumed that the cause of death was a gunshot to the head. But the coroner uncovered the chilling truth: the woman had been beaten to death with a hammer. Shona's fingers were broken. Apparently, she had desperately tried to defend herself against the attacker, but to no avail. The inhuman assailant methodically struck her until the unfortunate victim stopped showing signs of life. In total, Shona's body had a staggering 17 marks from hammer blows. George was the first on the list of suspects. He had found the body of his ex-wife, and the couple was in the process of divorcing. However, the man had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the crime, he was on a 24-hour shift, which was confirmed by his colleagues and surveillance camera footage. Therefore, George had to be excluded from the circle of suspects. Shona's neighbors told investigators that they had heard strange noises coming from her apartment that night. But no one paid much attention to it, as the woman usually returned home from work late. And another resident of the building found some documents and personal belongings of the deceased, such as her phone and cosmetic bag, near the dumpsters and immediately handed them over to the police. The investigators remembered the recent break-in at Shona's apartment, during which the perpetrator had stolen some valuables and left men's underwear in the dwelling. Even then, this detail seemed suspicious to the cops, so they decided to take a closer look at this angle. Shona was an extremely attractive and striking woman, so she could well have had a secret admirer-stalker obsessed with her. This would explain the theft of her bikini. Or perhaps she accidentally caught the eye of a burglar who had just broken into the house, and when Shona unexpectedly returned home, the thief had to deal with an unwanted witness. This version also aligned with the fact that the victim's personal belongings were found near the crime scene. Perhaps the thief had grabbed them along with the valuables and then lost them while fleeing. But as the investigation unfolded, it turned out that no valuables were missing from Shona's apartment, so the version of a failed robbery had to be discarded. The murdered woman's colleagues were stunned and horrified by this brutal killing. They feared that the maniac who had stalked Shona might come after them as well. The detectives carefully studied the surveillance camera footage from the victim's workplace to check if someone had been constantly following her. But the video materials did not confirm the version of a stalker. Judging by them, no one was watching Shona. Thus, this lead also turned out to be false. Upon learning of the tragedy, the victim's sister Paula and her husband took the first flight to Las Vegas to join the investigation. Unlike the bewildered detectives, she immediately stated that she was certain who had committed this horrible crime. Paula suspected George, Shona's ex-husband. In her opinion, he could have either dealt with his ex-wife himself or hired someone to do it. Meanwhile, the police received information that one of the local homeless men had been bragging somewhere about beating a woman to death with a hammer. At first, no one paid much attention to this, as such drunken babbling is not uncommon among vagrants. But when gruesome rumors about Shona's brutal murder began to spread through the city, the homeless man's words took on an ominous meaning. The cops quickly tracked down the suspicious character near the store where he constantly hung around, trying to swipe food. When they searched him, they found illegal substances, which was enough for an arrest. The detainee identified himself as Noyo Stevens. He had previously been held responsible for minor offenses but categorically denied any involvement in Shona's murder. The detectives visited the abandoned tent in the desert where Noyo lived and thoroughly searched the surrounding area. There they managed to find quite a few interesting things. Next to the tent itself lay bloody jeans, which were immediately sent for examination to the forensic laboratory. The DNA analysis results confirmed the investigators' suspicions. The blood on the pants belonged to Shona, and the piece of evidence was abundantly strewn with Noyo's genetic material. A receipt from a store was also found in the pocket of the jeans. The police immediately requested the surveillance camera footage from the point of sale for the time indicated on the receipt. The video clearly shows Noyo paying cash for a hammer and a pair of men's boxers. Continuing to dig into the suspect's past, the cops turned to checking his phone contacts. It turned out that Noyo had only one regular contact, with whom he had called 87 times. And, lo and behold, this contact turned out to be none other than George Tiafi, the widower of the murdered Shona. This vagrant was the same homeless friend whom George had brought home and who had so frightened Shona that she had even moved out from her husband. Noyo confirmed that George was listed in his contacts as a firefighter friend. The detectives reviewed the store's video footage again to find out how Noyo got there. And they saw that the homeless man did not come to the store alone, but with some man, and the two of them spent a long time selecting goods. This companion, of course, was George, Shona's ex-husband. Now the whole picture came together like a puzzle. George had persuaded his vagrant friend to help him get rid of his wife. He carefully planned the crime, informing his accomplice when exactly Shona would return home. George also chose a day for the terrible massacre when he himself would be on a 24-hour shift, thereby providing himself with an impeccable alibi. The ex-husband was convinced that he had organized the perfect murder that would never be solved. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. When the detectives announced to Noyo what evidence they had against him, he quickly gave in and admitted that it was he who had brutally killed Shona. But he immediately began giving testimony, accusing George of organizing the crime. According to him, George had long wished for his wife's death and had even paid his accomplice an advance of $600. And after successfully completing the order, he promised to reward him with several more tens of thousands, as soon as he received the insurance money for his wife. It immediately became clear to the police what motive drove the mastermind behind the murder: the desire for easy profit. As Noyo recounted, he and George had carefully planned this crime well in advance. 3 weeks before the massacre, they staged a robbery of Shona's home to throw the detectives off the trail, directing the investigation down the wrong path. Noyo felt sincere gratitude towards George, who for many years had been his best and only friend, helping and supporting him in every way possible. Therefore, the vagrant agreed without hesitation to assist his buddy in getting rid of his annoying wife. Noyo described in detail what happened in the house on the day of the murder. He had snuck into the apartment in advance, while Shona was not at home, using the spare key that George had given him. The attacker patiently waited for the victim in ambush. Hearing the lock click in the door, Noyo put on a mask and hid. When the unsuspecting Shona went upstairs, the killer jumped out of hiding and pounced on her from behind, armed with a hammer. From the unexpected blow, the woman fell to the floor, and Noyo, leaping on top of her, began to hammer her on the head with all his might. Shona desperately fought back, crying and pleading, repeating over and over, "Why? Why are you doing this?" But when she saw the attacker's face, she immediately understood everything. However, it was too late. The frenzied killer could not leave her alive. The terrible blows rained down with such fury that the hammer could not withstand it and broke. But even this did not stop the enraged Noyo. Grabbing the metal part, the crazed executioner continued to torment the defenseless victim until she stopped moving. Having finished his dirty deed, the killer fled, not even bothering to close the door of the house. Noyo indicated the place where he had hidden the murder weapon, near his tent shelter in the desert. And indeed, the broken hammer was found there. The detectives summoned George's mother and sister for questioning and informed them of his involvement in this horrific crime. The relatives categorically denied that he could be capable of such brutality. Immediately after talking to the police, the frightened sister called George and warned him that the investigators already knew everything and would soon come for him. The man realized that this was the end. In desperation, he grabbed his car keys, drove the vehicle at a breakneck speed of over 100 kilometers per hour, and crashed into a fence. The cops suspect that with this suicidal act, George was trying to settle scores with life, because there were no traces of braking on the road, so the accident was intentional. Amazingly, the man survived the collision, although he suffered serious injuries. George was hospitalized, and as soon as the doctors allowed transportation, the suspect was arrested on charges of murdering his wife. To this, he replied only with a terse, "Okay." George Tiafi and his accomplice Noyo Stevens were officially charged with the brutal murder of Shona Castleton. However, George stubbornly denied any involvement in this crime against his ex-wife. During a search of his house, the police found a gun purchased shortly after Shona's death. Detectives suspect that George planned to get rid of his homeless friend in order not to share the insurance money with him and to remove an unwanted witness before the trial. The evidence against Noyo Stevens was simply staggering, and the man fully admitted his guilt. Therefore, his trial ended very quickly. Noyo made a deal with the investigation and agreed to testify against George during his trial. Thanks to this agreement, the prosecutors dropped the demand for the death penalty for Stevens. However, this did not save him from the most severe punishment, life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than 42 years later. But as for George, there was little evidence against him, mostly circumstantial evidence and Noyo's testimony. The prosecutors understood that Tiafi had manipulated his simple-minded homeless friend, who did not have enough intelligence to organize such an intricate plot on his own. But proving this in court was extremely difficult, and George had every chance of getting off scot-free. George's defense attorney skillfully portrayed to the jury the image of his client as a heroic firefighter, an exemplary family man, devoted to his beloved wife and daughter. The lawyer insisted that Noyo had killed Shona out of revenge, as the woman disliked the vagrant and was divorcing his best friend. And George, allegedly, had nothing to do with it at all. The defense also claimed that Stevens suffered from a mental disorder and hallucinations, and therefore his words should not be trusted. So convincing the jury of Tiafi's guilt seemed like an almost impossible task. However, the store's surveillance camera footage, showing Noyo and George together choosing a hammer, as well as printouts of their phone conversations, became extremely compelling evidence of a conspiracy. Although Tiafi's lawyer tried to downplay their significance, saying that the men were just friends, often communicated, and bought the hammer for household needs. Throughout the entire trial, George maintained a remarkably impassive demeanor, even when his closest friend Noyo testified against him. Tiafi's relatives, friends, and colleagues unanimously assured that he was an extremely kind and even-tempered man who would never harm anyone. They claimed that George loved Shona and their daughter immensely and could never have ordered the murder of his adored wife. However, the jury did not believe these moving speeches. Only 3 long years after Shona's terrible murder did justice finally prevail. George Tiafi was found guilty of conspiracy and first-degree murder. His loved ones pleaded for leniency in sentencing, but to no avail. The court handed down the harshest possible punishment to George, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the announcement of the verdict, the convict showed no emotion. His family refused to believe in George's guilt and disagreed with the court's decision. On the other hand, Shona's relatives were completely satisfied with this outcome. They were convinced that the best punishment for her killer would be to rot behind bars until the end of his days. However, George later filed an appeal, claiming that his lawyer had been ineffective and had ignored the documented mental health issues of his client. Allegedly, Tiafi had been taking potent medications that clouded his mind. In this state, he heard the voice of God himself, who supposedly ordered him to kill his wife for the sake of saving his daughter. But the defense attorney did not even send George for a psychiatric evaluation. However, the lawyer refuted all these accusations, stating that he was hearing about Tiafi's mental health problems for the first time. Thus, the appeal was rejected. Shona's 1-year-old daughter lost both parents at once. Now the girl lives with her grandmother, and her Aunt Paula often visits her. Madison never forgets to remember her beloved mother and misses her terribly. In the middle of the workweek, on May 28, 2008, Mora Jones, a 40-year-old woman, planned to spend the night at the home of her beloved man, Paul Thompson. She came to his place after work, bringing along a bag with overnight essentials and a change of clothes. However, in the evening, a disagreement arose between the lovers. After the quarrel, Mora decided that it would be better to return to her own home and spend the night in her own apartment. Around 11 o'clock in the evening, she left Paul's house but never made it back to her dwelling that night. Mora lived alone in her apartment in the city of Glasgow, Scotland. Her windows offered a stunning view of the park. She had moved here from London in 2003 when she got a new job. Mora held the position of a manager in a company that produced non-alcoholic beverages. She really enjoyed living and working in Glasgow, as the city was famous for its picturesque parks and wonderful places for outdoor recreation. Since moving there, she had made many new friends. Mora was fond of Glasgow residents for their warm and friendly nature and sense of humor. For 4 years now, Mora had been dating a man named Paul Thompson. Their relationship was very serious, and she was even contemplating marriage. But suddenly, the woman vanished without a trace. Late in the evening, she left Paul's apartment, taking her things, and headed to her own place. However, in the morning, when her fiancé tried to call her, she didn't answer the phone. This greatly alarmed him. He began to search for his beloved. Meanwhile, in the morning, park workers discovered the body of a woman lying in the bushes in the middle of Glasgow's Royal Park. They immediately reported the horrifying find to the police. Law enforcement officers who arrived at the crime scene thoroughly examined everything around. The deceased was lying face down, her body naked from the waist down. She had a torn jacket and bra on, but they remained on the body. The victim's pants were lying underneath her. Nearby lay a woman's purse, in which documents in the name of Mora Jones were found. This allowed the police to quickly establish the identity of the deceased. The officers went to Mora's building, which was located not far from the park. The woman died before managing to cover some 100 meters to her own home. Her car was parked nearby. The police wanted to involve Mora's loved ones in identifying the body, but no one was home, and no one answered the door. Investigators tracked down the relatives of the deceased, who lived in the town of Weston. They were Steve and Archer. Detectives contacted them and invited them to identify the body. Mora's parents got in the car and drove to Glasgow. Their daughter's face was so disfigured that, in order not to shock the relatives too much, it was decided to show it to them via a TV screen. They confirmed that it was indeed Mora who had become the victim of the crime. The grief-stricken parents informed their daughter's brother about her death, and he urgently flew in from Australia for the funeral. While forensic experts worked diligently at the crime scene, no clues were found. Near Mora's car, pieces of a strap from her purse and a cosmetic bag were discovered. Investigators assumed that the woman was attacked when she was near the vehicle and then dragged into the park, where the crime was committed. They seized recordings from the park's surveillance cameras and began to thoroughly study them. In addition, law enforcement officers started looking for possible witnesses to the attack. The body of the deceased was sent for an autopsy. The forensic medical examiner established that the woman was brutally beaten and before dying. DNA, left during the attack, was extracted from her body. The sample was sent to the laboratory for analysis. The obtained results were compared with the database, but no matches were found. The first suspect in this case was Mora's fiancé, Paul Thompson, as he was the last one to see her alive on that fatal night. He was summoned to the police station for questioning. It turned out that Paul had no alibi. The man said that after the argument, Mora left, and he, offended, stayed at home and went to bed without even trying to catch up with her. Waking up in the morning, Paul realized that he had acted incorrectly. He tried to call his beloved to apologize and arrange a meeting, but she did not answer the phone. Then the man went first to Mora's home and then to her work, but he could not find her anywhere. Later, he learned the terrible news about his fiancée's murder. Paul's DNA sample was taken and sent for testing. The results showed that his genetic material did not match the DNA. Thus, the man was excluded from the circle of suspects. Investigators believed that the main motive for Mora's murder was probably, the woman accidentally crossed paths with a maniac who was hunting for victims that night. After attacking Mora and committing his crime, he killed her to get rid of an unwanted witness. Detectives compiled a list of all offenders registered in Glasgow. The list contained 22 names. Investigators began to check them, they conducted interviews with each of them, took DNA samples, and examined their alibis. Many of the suspects had confirmed alibis. The results of DNA tests showed that none of those on the list was involved in the crime. Then the circle of suspects was expanded. The police began to check all criminals who lived in the area and had ever committed offenses. But this also yielded no results. Next, law enforcement officers started working through all suspicious individuals spotted in the area, the homeless, alcoholics, and troubled teenagers. But this did not bring any benefit either. Recordings from the park's surveillance cameras also provided no clues. None of the cameras covered the crime scene. However, the police were lucky to obtain recordings from surveillance cameras on buses that passed by the park during the time period when the murder occurred. Detectives began to carefully study this video footage. Thoroughly examining the recordings from the surveillance cameras, investigators noticed how Mora Jones enters the park accompanied by an unknown man in the middle of the night. However, the woman never came out of the park. Instead, sometime later, the same mysterious man of athletic build appeared on the footage, leaving the park alone. The stranger exited the park near the Baptist church at 2:15 a.m. He immediately drew the attention of detectives and became the main suspect in the murder. Law enforcement officers continued to meticulously study the video recordings, hoping to find at least some clues that could lead them to the criminal's trail. While one group of investigators was reviewing the surveillance footage, other law enforcement officers went to interview residents of the buildings adjacent to the park. Most of those interviewed stated that they had not heard or seen anything suspicious that night. One of the residents said that around midnight, she heard a loud female scream that suddenly stopped. Two other couples who were walking in the park also heard some screams. And one of the taxi drivers even said to his partner upon hearing a bone-chilling shriek, "If a murder was committed here tonight, we just witnessed it." Despite the late hour, the street was still quite busy, but none of the witnesses who heard the scream called the police or rushed to help Mora. Eventually, the police got lucky when Lucy Pektlova, a woman of Czech origin, opened the door for them. She told the investigators some interesting details. According to Lucy, Marek Harker, whom she had sheltered out of pity, lived with her in the apartment. Marek was a 33-year-old former soldier from Slovakia, of strong build, and was fond of kickboxing. He and Lucy had met a year ago when they worked together in Liverpool, and then their paths diverged. When Marek showed up in Glasgow again on May 18, 2008, he had nowhere to stay, so he remembered Lucy. Being kind and accommodating, she allowed him to live with her while he looked for a job. However, Marek did not even try to find employment. Instead, he constantly drank, behaved indecently, and watched porn films all the time. Such behavior frightened Lucy, and she wanted to get rid of the unwanted guest as soon as possible. But the woman was afraid to kick him out. On the eve of Mora's murder, Marek got very drunk and behaved inadequately. Around 10 in the evening, he left Lucy's house, stating that he was going to look for prostitutes. He returned at 3:15 a.m. By that time, Lucy was already asleep, so she did not see the condition her tenant was in, she only heard him opening the door. In the morning, Merrick seemed completely different, as if something had happened. The man was frightened, hastily gathered his things, and fled the apartment without saying a word to Lucy. He never returned. In his haste, Merrick left some of his belongings behind. When Lucy learned about the tragedy in the park, she immediately suspected her lodger and shared her suspicions with the police. Investigators found out that Merrick had bought a ticket for the first available flight and flown to the Czech Republic, from where he took a bus to Slovakia. After that, his trail was lost. While examining the things Merrick had left in Lucy's apartment, the police found blood stains on his leather jacket. They seized the suspect's belongings, including his toothbrush, and sent them along with the jacket for DNA analysis. The results showed that Merrick's genetic material matched the samples taken from the victim's body, and the blood on the jacket belonged to Mora. Moreover, among the suspect's belongings, the murdered woman's personal items were found, her broken phone and camera. It seemed that Merrick had taken them with him while fleeing the crime scene. Based on the collected evidence, an arrest warrant was issued for Merrick Harker. The police managed to track down his whereabouts. On June 18, 2008, Merrick was arrested while hiding in a house in a northern village of Slovakia. The suspect was extradited to Great Britain. He was charged with murder and robbery. However, Merrick denied his guilt on all counts. The trial in Merrick Harker's case began on March 12, 2009, in the city of Glasgow. The defendant never pleaded guilty to the crimes he was charged with. During the court hearing, the prosecutor noted that Merrick had arrived in the United Kingdom back in 2007 and had managed to work in Liverpool. And 10 days before the tragic events, he appeared in Glasgow and stayed with an acquaintance. All this time, the defendant behaved inappropriately, he drank a lot and was consumed by lust. On that fatal night, Merrick went to the park with the intention of finding prostitutes and fulfilling his perverted fantasies with them. But apparently, there were no hookers to be found that night. So Merrick left the park by another route, weaving between the buildings. At the ill-fated hour of around 11:30 p.m., Mora Jones got out of her car near the park, heading home with a large black suitcase. Merrick had completely different plans for her. The man attacked Mora with the intention of robbing her. The criminal forced the victim to go with him to the park. This moment was captured by a surveillance camera. Merrick was much taller and more heavily built than the slender Mora, so she had no chance of resisting. The attacker's size and clothing fully matched Merrick's description. The prosecution claimed that, having dragged Mora into the park, Merrick brutally beat and also stole some of the victim's belongings. At 2:15 a.m., the criminal left the park. According to Lucy, who had provided shelter to Merrick, the man returned home only at 3:15 a.m. In the morning, he behaved unusually. Sober and frightened, Merrick hastily gathered his things and fled, leaving some of his belongings behind. It was these items he left that allowed a DNA examination to be conducted, which proved his involvement in Mora's murder. The autopsy results indicated that Mora died at approximately 2 a.m. That is, after the attack, the unfortunate woman lived for about 2 more hours. If someone from the people present in the park, upon hearing the victim's screams, had called for help, her life could still have been saved. Unfortunately, no one did that. None of the witnesses considered it necessary to help the woman who was being killed. This news about the shocking human indifference and callousness became a real shock for Mora's family. The deceased woman died a horrific and excruciating death. Experts counted at least 65 injuries on her body, although the exact number could not be established. The killer mercilessly pummeled his victim with his hands and feet all over her body. He literally beat Mora to death and left her to die in terrible agony. The face of the deceased was mutilated beyond recognition, a broken nose, split lip, knocked out teeth, all covered in bruises. It's no wonder it was so hard for her parents to identify her. The criminal behaved like a mad beast who maimed and disfigured a beautiful and successful woman. Mora had severe head injuries, fractures of the right cheekbone and larynx, and broken ribs. Her entire body was covered with huge bruises. In the forensic expert's opinion, death occurred as a result of injuries to the head and neck. During his testimony in court, he noted that small hemorrhages in the victim's eyes indicated that she had been strangled. Characteristic bruises on the back of her hands and forearms testified to desperate attempts to defend herself. Mora fought for her life with her tormentor with her last ounce of strength. However, she had almost no chance of withstanding the inhuman monster. The forensic expert noted that the killer did not use any weapons. An experienced kickboxer, Merrick dealt with the defenseless victim using only his fists and feet. The prosecutors provided the court with convincing evidence of the defendant's guilt. The genetic material of the extracted from Mora's body fully matched Merrick's DNA. The blood on his jacket also belonged to the deceased. Items belonging to the victim of the crime were found in the suspect's dwelling. The prosecutor petitioned for the most severe punishment deserved for this brutal, bestial murder. The defense insisted that the police had grabbed the wrong person. According to Merrick, he was not in the park at all that night, he was allegedly sleeping at home. The lawyer even proposed an alternative version of events. Allegedly, 3 people were involved in the murder, 2 brothers by the surname of Kareem, who attacked Mora in the park to steal her credit cards, and a certain Jason Mulheron, whom the brothers later named as the real killer. This Mulheron had a conviction for a crime, and one of the episodes of his criminal activity resembled the attack on Mora, although that time the victim was not killed. Jason lived near Mora's house and had no alibi at the time of her murder. According to the defense, the man allegedly confessed to the murder to his ex-girlfriend, saying it was he who finished off the woman in the park. Upon learning about this chilling confession, the ex-girlfriend reported it to the police. However, as it turned out, law enforcement officers thoroughly checked this information. Jason Mulheron's DNA did not match the traces at the crime scene. The suspect himself denied any involvement in Mora's murder and insisted that he had not confessed to anything to his ex-girlfriend. It seemed that this was a false lead that the defense lawyer had latched onto in order to divert suspicion from his client. Later, the Kareem brothers confessed that on the night in question, they had indeed broken into Mora's car and stolen her credit cards, but they had not seen the woman and had not touched her. They made up the story about Mulheron the killer to save their own skin. The lawyer tried to persuade the jury to acquit Merrick Harker and urged them to be skeptical of the evidence provided by the prosecution, claiming that the conclusions of the DNA examination could only indicate the involvement of a particular person in the crime with high probability but not with certainty. In the defense counsel's opinion, the results of the DNA analysis should be considered only as one piece of evidence among others. These attempts by the lawyer to sow distrust in genetic expertise aroused indignation among the other participants in the process. The prosecutor retorted, "The probability that the biological material from the crime scene belongs to someone other than the defendant is equal to 1 chance in a billion, so this assumption is not even worth discussing." The court took into account that in his homeland, Merrick already had 13 convictions, 4 of which were for actions. He had spent many years behind bars. People who knew him in Slovakia characterized him as a cruel, aggressive, and prone guy. Lucy, who had imprudently let him into her home, was extremely lucky that she did not share the fate of her compatriot Mora. The system that allowed a dangerous repeat offender to enter Great Britain should be blamed. The trial lasted 20 days. It took the jury less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Merrick Harker was found guilty on all counts. The judge handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than after 25 years. Addressing the convicted man, he noted, "By your actions that night, you displayed an extraordinary, unheard-of cruelty." As Merrick was being led out of the courtroom, the crowd greeted him with shouts of "Beast, Savage, Executioner." The horrific story of Mora Jones's death shook the entire British public. Many were outraged at how it was possible for a foreign recidivist to easily cross the border, end up on the streets of a peaceful city, and become a deadly threat to local residents. After the verdict was announced, Harker was entered into the British Register of Offenders, and it was decided that after serving his sentence, he would be deported to his homeland. However, already in November 2016, Marek was extradited to Slovakia, where he will serve the remainder of his sentence. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.